For this episode of Coffee with Closers, I'm sitting down with Nick Mehta, the CEO of Gainsight, the customer success company. He works with a team of over 1,000 human beings who together have helped create the customer success category that's currently taking over the SaaS business model worldwide. Stay tuned for my conversation with Nick, where he shares practical advice on leveraging customer retention as a growth strategy for both SaaS and service companies.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Coffee with Closers, where business leaders share insights on how to build businesses from the ground up and best practices for innovating in their industry.
Hey, Nick, I'm super excited to have you join me for this episode of Coffee with Closers.
Thank you so much, Samuel. It's great to be here.
Awesome. You know, I had multiple people tell me I should have Nick join Godard Abel from G2, Tim Kopp from Terminus, all those guys that, hey, if I ask all the time at the end of the episode, who should I have next? And they say, well, you should talk to Tim. You should talk to Nick. So I'm super excited. I've been looking forward to it. You're a busy guy. It took a little while for us to schedule this. So every entrepreneur has an interesting story of how they overcame obstacles to become an entrepreneur. I'm sure you have some interesting story of how that may have happened for you. Can you share with our audience a little bit about your entrepreneurial journey?
Totally. Yeah. Well, it's a long journey because I've been working for a couple decades now. So I'll try to give you the Cliff Notes version. Part of the obstacle was as with a lot of kids trying to, live up to my parents' expectations. So that was part of it. As a little kid, my mom wanted me to be a doctor and my dad wanted me to go into business. So I had to make one of them happy and not the other. And as you saw when you did your prep, Samuel, I studied biochemistry in college, probably just to make my mom happy, thinking I'd be a doctor. But I always loved computers and business and stuff, which is kind of what my dad did. And so I ended up getting into the business world. I was kind of programming when I was a little kid and, grew up around computers. So it's sort of one of those things you probably, in hindsight, was obvious I'd end up in it. And I started a company in college, actually, with some classmates. This is back during the .com era. So for many of you listening, that's ancient history, but late 1990s. And we started a company, which ended up becoming a pretty hot company, but then ended up not making it. And we'd sold it, but it was sort of an up and down story. And so I had a lot of experience of just both the positives and the heartbreak of business before I was 22. So pretty interesting getting all that early on. And then I worked at a bigger company for a while, was a product manager, then was a general manager. And then I ran a company before Gainsight, which actually taught me on the job the need of customer success because it was my first SaaS company. And it was the first time I had a situation where the customers had all the power, where if they weren't getting value, they just wouldn't renew, right? And before that, I'd worked in businesses where you sell a customer and you move on to the next customer. But when I saw this model and I saw, oh my gosh, everything changes when your customers have power, I thought this customer success thing could be pretty big. Now that was 2013. And back then it wasn't big. Back then in the whole world, there was like 1,000 people in CSM in the job of customer success. And today there's about 300,000. But one of the biggest challenges we had was we had to kind of create our own market. We had to, like people talk about creating a category. We had to create the category of people in this job, which we can talk a lot more about. But yeah, in terms of setbacks, I think generally I've been very blessed and privileged and lucky. But one of them has been, okay, what does it mean when you have to create your own market?
Yeah. I mean, I was looking at your LinkedIn profile. I did see biochemistry and then computer science, and then ended up being a marketing intern at IBM. And then you also went on to Goldman Sachs, doing some internship there in marketing as well. So I saw your journey has been very unique. And then obviously I was looking at some of your prior venture. You actually co-founded one or two companies. I saw ChipShot and LiveOffice.
ChipShot, yeah, that was the one in college. Yep. So
I see. Okay, and so and then you went on to being a product manager.
Yeah.
And then
that was kind of that was my first real job because I had done my own startup and I was like, that startup didn't end up working out. So I had to get a regular job. And I was like, well, I like computer science, but I'm not really that good of an engineer. So what do you do? If you like computers, but you're not that good of an engineer, be a product manager. So that's how I got into product management.
Yeah. And then the idea so you said once you started seeing companies that were doing recurring or subscription-based product, that's when you actually start to see a need for how do you really leverage customer success as a means to retain and grow those accounts? Is that kind of where the idea?
I'll be a little more precise. So what happened was at the big company I worked at was Symantec. It's a large software company, great company. And I was a product manager and eventually I was a general manager. So I ran a division in Symantec and all the software we sold was the traditional kind of what people call on-premise software, meaning they buy the software, they pay for it up front, they install it on their servers, and whether they use it or not is up to them. But they basically have paid for it already. Kind of like when you buy a car, you pay for the car. If you never drive it, you still paid for the car. And I then got hired by a SaaS company called Live Office, where I was a CEO. I didn't found the company. I got hired to run it. And I came in, and basically this company was a cloud-based business, a SaaS business, right? And it was basically doing something similar to what my product did at Symantec, but instead of it being installed on people's servers, it was all run in the cloud. And what I learned with that change in kind of delivery model and pricing model, I learned that the customer now has all the power. Because running this company Live Office every quarter, it wasn't just about how many new customers I could get or how much we could sell. It was about keeping those existing customers and growing them and making them happy. And as a CEO, I spent a lot of my time, not just on getting new customers, but on our existing clients. And so through that process, I learned, gosh, this like customer success thing is pretty important. I didn't actually even know what it was before, right? And I learned it on the job. I also saw that we didn't have any systems to manage it. So we had systems to manage sales and marketing and other areas, but nothing for our customers. And so anyway, those two insights together, we basically, in 2013, I was spending some time with some venture capital firms. And one of them actually introduced me to these two folks who basically had the same kind of idea and passion. And we all partnered up together and launched Gainsight in 2013.
Yeah, and I think I'm just curious also just that transition. When did it happen, guys? My understanding of SaaS was it Adobe the first to introduce the whole concept of SaaS or subscription model, was it Salesforce?
No. I mean, it's probably. I'm sure somebody had it before, but the one that I think everyone would say popularized it is Salesforce, right? And they launched obviously in 1999, and so a long time ago. And Salesforce, even they didn't know about customer success till they had to go do it. So we've written 3 books on customer success, and in the first book we tell the story about this offsite in Salesforce, and I think it's like 2002 or something. And they started having churn because people were buying the Salesforce subscription, and some of them just never set it up or never used it, and they would churn. And then Salesforce said, what are we going to do about this, right? Because all the people at Salesforce had come from on-premise software companies too. They'd never dealt with this before. And so Mark Benioff, in his incredible brilliance, basically said, hey, we need a new role called a customer success manager. And that role, he's the one who gets credit for it. He came up with this, he and his team came up with this idea. They built the first CSM team. And then the early SaaS companies all followed suit, Workday, Box, DocuSign. And when Gainsight launched in 2013, we saw these CSMs in a few companies. And we said, eventually this is going to be everyone. And that's how we kind of decided to take it mainstream. But Salesforce is the one that really kind of got this thing started.
So interesting question about Salesforce, because I know Salesforce actually charges extra for customer service on top of your subscription to the product. So, I mean, why would they even charge extra if their ultimate goal is to retain and grow those accounts? Why are they separating service, customer service?
Yeah. So they actually do both. So actually it's interesting. Just today I was doing an interview with the head of customer success at Salesforce, and we were talking about learnings and all that. They do both. So in the early days, they actually did all customer success just for free built into the product. They actually made that at the very beginning, right? And then like a lot of companies had to figure out how to scale, and they had just so much, growing customers, and, how do we fund all this customer success? So they basically bifurcated it. So there's amount of customer success you get that's kind of built into the Salesforce subscription. That's things like some of their automated communications, their user groups, their training. And then there's a part of it that you can pay for. Now, the reality is, even there, one of the things they've been trying to do is get smarter about aligning what you're paying for with real business value. So one thing they've done is like really aligned customer success by industry, so that like there's a different kind of mode for, let's say, life sciences versus financial services. So they themselves evolved a lot. A lot of companies over time end up with some stuff that's built in and some stuff that you pay extra for.
Yeah, because one of the biggest, negative I've heard about Salesforce is the service side of it, like customer service side of it, the fact that you have to pay extra for it. And that's always been kind of the negative. And when you look at HubSpot, they provide support even on Sunday evening. You could call with a question, and there's a live person in the US answer your question. And that seems to be kind of the driver for HubSpot success. Because they do too.
Well, and I think in general, whether Salesforce or HubSpot or anyone else, I think everyone is trying to say, how do we invest more in the customer experience to make sure our customers get more value every day? So that's definitely a universal theme.
Yeah, and I know you guys are getting into the product experience category as well, right?
Right.
Expanding in there. So I know you mentioned Nick.
And that's a part. Just for folks listening, the reason that matters is you can only do so much with people, right? You have your customer success managers, you've got your customer support team, you're doing a great job with your customers. But what really drives success for your customers is the product. And so our product experience technology is a small amount of code you can drop into your app with almost no extra effort. And then now you can kind of in the app guide a customer through little pop-up messages to try out a new feature or to onboard better or to keep using the product. And so this is a big trend we're seeing, which is customer success isn't just about a team. It's about building customer success into your whole company.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if the customers aren't adapting and staying with the product, you're just churning and keep going back to trying to keep winning more logos every month.
That's right. And you can't if you have a bucket and you have a hole at the bottom of the bucket, pouring more water in doesn't really help. So
yeah, we talk a lot in our company. We talk acquisition plus retention equals growth. You kind of have to do both.
Yeah, exactly.
Very efficiently.
That's right.
So obviously, you successfully created a category. I mean, that's like the dream in the SaaS world is creating a category. You've done that in the customer success sector. And you talk a lot about, net revenue retention. You've written 3 books about customer success. So you've learned a lot. I mean, primarily you serve this SaaS market. And that's where, the technology enabled the retention, right? Able to identify accounts that are probably at risk and trying to find the opportunities that you can expand. There's a lot of that you can do with a SaaS. But what are some transferable knowledge from the SaaS industry that service companies can adapt in terms of retention and growth of existing accounts?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, it's interesting enough, 50% of our revenue comes from companies that are not mainly SaaS businesses. So we actually see a lot of interest in this model in other industries because the model of customer success, if you really just boil it down and simplify it, is, okay, I need to proactively make sure my customer is getting value. I can't make it on them. I got to make it my job because if they're not getting value, they're not going to stay with me. They're not going to buy more stuff. They're not going to be an advocate. I've got to own that responsibility. Now, as we talked about in the prep, Samuel, one of the differences is unfortunately the companies outside of SaaS don't always have that data about how people are using your product. Because in SaaS, because it's in the cloud, you can kind of see, okay, what are they clicking? But you have lots of other data, right? You have data, for example, about how engaged they are with you, how often they're meeting with you. Are they active in your online community? Are they coming to your events? Are they opening your emails, right? You have all this other digital data that every business now has that you could be using to understand how healthy this customer is. Because that's a core concept, is this idea of customer health, right? You think about in sales, you have your pipeline and you have your opportunities, and then you close deals. And your pipeline is a leading indicator of your opportunities and your deals. The same way, you can think of your customer health as a leading indicator of your likelihood to renew and expand that customer. And so what should go into customer health? Are they engaging with me? Did the person we sell to leave the company? You could look at looking at LinkedIn and things like that, right? Are they having a lot of issues? Like, are they calling in with a lot of problems? You probably send them surveys. What kind of feedback are they giving? Did they never even fill out the survey? So you could be smartly looking at all this data, kind of like a breadcrumb trail for the customer, to build a picture of, how successful, how satisfied is this customer.
Mm-hmm. And so how large of a customer base do you have to have before an investment into a platform like Gainsight is almost a necessity?
It tends to be like the simple heuristic would be when you get to the point where you can't remember all your customers, like their names, then you're probably, looking at software. So that means, hundreds of customers typically, right? If you've got 20 customers, usually you can kind of, do most of it yourself. But the truth is, even if you have 20 customers, there are other parts of our product line that might be relevant, like this product experience area, where even though you only have 20 customers, you want all of them to use your product well, right? We also have an online community that connects your customers with each other so they can learn from each other. But for the core customer success concept, I think once you get into the hundreds of customers, that's when the scale and really literally just remembering it all becomes really challenging.
So as from a business leadership standpoint, right, what is kind of like the resource allocation recommendations that you have? Is it like 80-20, 80% into the acquisition side of the business and 20% into retention, or is it 50-50? What is the kind of the happy medium?
It really depends on where you're on the life cycle of your business, right? So, companies that are in a net new gigantic market are going to focus mostly on acquisition. That's totally understandable mathematically, right? Because you're trying to get that land grab, right? Get all those customers so that they stay with you. Companies that are in a more focused market, right? Let's say you're a vertical company, you're selling into one industry or one region. You better get it right, because one of the challenges you have is if those customers aren't successful, there's not a lot of other ones to sell to. You can kind of burn through your whole market. I'm sure if you're listening, you can think of companies that you've dealt with that are like that, where they've like sold to everyone and nobody likes them and there's nobody else to sell to. So they're kind of in trouble. So if your market is a little more focused, even in the early days, you've got to be really focused on customer success. But either way, whether your market is big or it's more vertical, once you get to a certain size where a lot of your revenue is coming from existing customers, you've got to get great at all this stuff, right? That's really where the shift happens. Most people have that moment where they're like, oh my gosh, this quarter, more of our revenue is coming from existing clients than new ones. We've got to do something different. Whenever that moment is, that's when you got to do things differently.
Yeah, and I know, kind of the rule of thumb is, I think it's like about almost 7 to 8 times more expensive to acquire a new customer than to retain. Has there been any studies done by Gainsight that validates that point, or even?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, it's pretty simple, because you look at what companies spend anywhere from 10 to 20 cents on the dollar or less to keep and grow an existing customer, and they spend anywhere from like 50 cents to like $2 on the dollar to get a new one, right? So just do the math on that, and you'll see it's a massive difference in basically cost. Now, obviously, I don't want to write off those new customers are important, because those are the ones down the road that will grow, and you got to keep bringing new ones in too. That's very important. But the thing is that, like, at the end of the day, sometimes you get to a point where you're like, gosh, we've got to grow our existing customers. We've got to keep them. And like I said, the issue is, if you don't take care of those customers, you won't get new ones either. Because eventually those customers that are unhappy and not getting value, word's going to get out, and you're not going to get any new ones. So, the party stops pretty quickly if you don't focus on your customers.
Yeah. And I think that, like you said, I think the lifetime value increases as they stick with you longer. So you can continue to serve them even better, right? You can improve your product. You can do a lot more, because if they're sticking around not long enough, your cost of acquisition is extremely high as well, right? By having them stick around longer, you're lowering your overall cost of acquisition, and you're increasing your lifetime value as well.
Exactly. And since you're very versed in acquisition, you think about, like, why would acquisition costs be higher versus lower? One of the reasons is people are a little more uncertain about buying. They're like, oh, I don't know, should we really buy this or not? You know what makes people more confident about buying? Hearing good things from other customers. So the more successful customers you have, the more advocacy you have, the more people are telling their friends, oh, you got to buy this product, the easier it is to sell, the lower your acquisition cost. So it's very much like a virtuous cycle.
Awesome to hear that. So obviously you had some your career started in marketing, and you went on to product, you became a CEO, then you started your own company, you're building a category in the customer success, right? You've had a lot of experience in the entire customer lifecycle. How has your approach in sales and marketing evolved over the years, having exposed to all these different areas of the business?
I think one of the biggest changes is understanding how it all fits together. So it's not, I think the old world was like, okay, marketing, you generate leads, and sales, you close deals, and services, you implement customers, and so on, right? Now it's like, no, gosh, everything affects everything else. How well you sell a customer and how well you do a good job of setting their expectations and doing discovery affects how well they're going to do post-sale. How well you service them affects how much they're going to be an advocate. When you market, you're not just marketing to new customers, you're marketing existing ones too. So these things are not, you'd love to separate them out and make it, okay, you own this, you own this. The biggest learning is it all fits together, and you have to think of it as one continuous thing versus a totally separate set of silos.
Yeah, which is, creating new organizational functions like revenue operations being one of them.
Yes, revenue is so important. RevOps is so important because of that, right? Exactly.
Yeah, because I think, like 5-7 years ago, people were talking about sales and marketing alignment only. Now you're talking about the entire organizational alignment, because
totally.
Yeah,
that's an interesting trend, because RevOps, revenue operations, or go-to-market operations, what do you call it, is bringing together marketing, sales, and customer success into sort of one integrated view. I was talking to a friend of mine who's the CEO of a large public company, and he was just saying how he thinks of this as like one system that brings all these, he's not saying software system, like one conceptual system, all the way from marketing to sales to your customers. It's all about taking people from that lead all the way to being a successful customer.
Mm-hmm. So obviously, Nick, you successfully grew this company from $0 to $100 million in ARR, and was a valuation of $1.2 billion, I think, just a recent valuation, right?
A year and a half ago. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's definitely has grown up. So basically, like, what are some practical things you've done so well that actually took the company, grow at such a fast pace?
I think I've done lots of things not well, maybe a couple well. So it's hard to even remember the ones that I've done well. But I think one thing that, has worked really, really well for us is taking, really, really thinking about the human beings that are customers, right? So we talk about customer success. Part of it is your customer's company is successful, right? They're generating more revenue, being more productive. But part of it is your customers' human beings are successful. They're getting promoted. They're feeling good about their job. So we spend a lot of time on the human aspect of our customers. I've actually helped thousands and thousands of CS leaders find jobs and get connected to each other, or help CEOs find CS leaders, or helping give advice on compensation or org structures, really thinking about the human being, your customer. I think that's a superpower. And I think it applies to almost every business. So that's one that I think has been a big one for us, and we built in. Another one, I know we'll talk about culture in a little bit, but building our culture into our community. So our customers all know about our company values and our ethos, and we're very silly, and we bring that to our customers as well, so they know that. So that's something that I think has been, bring your culture to community, something that's really resonated with us. Now, on the internal side, just some practical stuff for us. One thing that's been really effective is creating a really organized rhythm for running the company. So this is something as you get bigger of just like, okay, what are you doing every day? What are you doing every week? What are you doing every month, every quarter, and every year? Right. And so we have it all very well documented about how our annual planning processes work, how we set goals every quarter, how we do, weekly executive meetings, and how we do an update to the company. And I send an email to the company. Actually, I've done this every day since 2006. Every Sunday night to whatever team I'm running, I send an email to the whole company about what's happening in the company right now, what's happening in my personal life. That's another thing we try to do, is be very open. So transparent. So I talk about what's happening in my personal life. Fun anecdote. Yesterday was my wife's birthday, and actually, I don't know if you know this term. If you know what the term Rickroll, do you know what Rickroll is? Rickroll is Rick Astley was the song that you probably heard of, "Never Gonna Give You Up," and it's a fun internet thing where you get somebody to play that song. And actually, I had for my wife's birthday yesterday, I had a like one of those kind of hired performers come and like surprise her on the street and like sing that song to her. And then I made a video of it. I shared it with all our employees. And the reason I tell you that story is I think that idea of transparency, like the CEO is a human being too, and has a wife or partner, husband, spouse, partner, whatever, and is a human being too, and really trying to be transparent about what we all are. We wrap all of that up in Gainsight, what we call human first business. The idea that, let's not forget, whether you think of your employee or your customer or your competitor, they're all human beings first.
Yeah, and I saw in your bio, you actually said I with 1,000 human beings, and I was kind of wondering.
Yes, exactly right.
Intentionally put that in there. Yeah,
that's why I said that. Exactly right. Good call.
So basically, let's talk about that a little bit more, because I know on Glassdoor you have about 99% approval rating as a CEO. And you've employees have stuck around with you for a very long time. So what are some things that you've done as the leader to make sure that the company culture was solid? And was that something that you got from prior experience, worked at other bigger organizations, or how did that come about?
So much. This is definitely the thing I'm most passionate about. And I think part of it was early on defining values. So we defined our values in the very, very beginning of the company. And those values, there's 5 values at Gainsight. Some examples: golden rule, which means treat people the way you want to be treated; childlike joy, which means bring the kid in you to work every day; shoshin, which is a Japanese word for beginner's mind; stay thirsty, my friends, which is all about ambition; and success for all, which means we only win if all of our stakeholders win. And so those values have specific examples and precepts, and every new hire, I'm doing the training for the class on what the values are. And that's all I talk about is our values. We talk about it in every meeting and every planning process and every all hands for 9.5 years. So the values, like defining them early, making sure there's something you're personally passionate about as a founder or CEO, and making them part of everything you do. That's, to me, really, really critical. As I mentioned, taking your culture and making it not just your company culture, but tying it to your customers and letting them know what your values are, and really like doing a great job of just living externally the same way you live internally. Don't be two different people outside your company and inside your company. We're big believers in vulnerability and transparency. I talked about my wife's birthday, but also the hard stuff of talking about I was very lonely as a kid. And I've talked a lot about that to my company and actually even to our customers as well at our conferences. So this idea of vulnerability, like Brene Brown talks about, something we're really, really passionate about. But then I think that if those are all kind of more broad things, I think there's an opportunity to just build lots of great moments into the daily life of teammates. There's a great book that I'm reading right now called The Power of Moments. It's an awesome book. Just the idea that like we remember very specific things about our experiences. It's not like you remember the whole experience. You remember the moments. And so as an example, we have 1,150 people in the company. I send every employee an email on their birthday and their anniversary at Gainsight, like every single employee. When our customers get promoted, I send them a bottle of champagne. And I have like a kind of custom bottle of champagne that we send. When a new employee comes to Gainsight, our teammate success is HR basically. They created this hilarious box that you open it up and for all new employees, and all these like paper butterflies like fly out of it. And then people make videos of it and post on Twitter and stuff. So it's the idea, how do you build like moments in to be memorable, whether it's your customer journey or your employee journey? Think about those moments. And by the way, they're not all the good moments, the bad ones too. Somebody loses his family member, and what are you doing right then? When they have a baby, we have a Gainsight onesie we send people when they have a baby, right? So those types of kind of moments, I think moments are so important.
Yeah, I mean, like going back to your concept of treating them like humans, right? And I think, and I admire you for actually doing the onboarding training, and also you said sending birthday wishes as the CEO. Are those automated, or are you actually personally getting some sort of a reminder saying, hey, this is this employee?
I get a reminder and I send for the birthday and anniversary, so it's not automated. I add in some personalization if I know them. Unfortunately, sadly, when you have 1,200 employees, you really don't know most of them.
Yeah, and there might be multiple birthdays every day because you're talking.
There's if you add birthdays and anniversaries, there's like 10 a day.
Well, yeah.
So yeah, and so but some of them I know, and I try to personalize it. Even if I don't know them, I think they appreciate it, right? And so I think it's just those little things. You can automate some of these things, but I think you can also like put a little more time into it, and that makes a difference, right?
Yeah.
So I just think there's so many things we can do in everyone's lives that have a big impact if you just think about those moments.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about this whole like the transparency, and also how you have like the organizational planning and all of those things. Are you following some sort of a business system like OKRs, or like an operating system like OKRs?
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned that because this is pretty practical. We read a book years ago as a company, 6 years ago, called Scaling Up. And it's a pretty good book if you're kind of, let's say you're 50 people or 100 people, 200 people, which might be a decent number of people listening to this. It's a great book for just defining your whole system. And basically the idea of the scaling up is you start by writing out for your annual strategy, a document. Actually, this is ours. You won't be able to read it because it's the glare here, but this is what's called a 1-page strategic plan. And it's basically, what are your goals for the year? What are your values for your company? What's your purpose and mission? All written down in one sheet. And we actually take this, we make it, we laminate it, we send it to all 1,100 people. And then in scaling up, then there's a kind of set of processes you do every quarter or every week. We don't do all of those anymore. We've kind of evolved a little bit, but conceptually this idea of like, if you can create a rhythm for the company, then everyone knows what to expect. And actually it saves a lot of time long-term versus every quarter scrambling to say, okay, we got to get ready for a board meeting, or we got an all hands meeting. We're very, very organized. By the way, a lot of credit goes there to my chief of staff, Robin Merritt, who basically runs that whole process for us.
So for organizations that don't have named leader or someone who can own some of those functions, right? You talk about so for marketing, you have to have an owner for that. And sales, you have to have a leader that runs that, and operation and customer success and product. If you don't have the luxury of all of those things, what are some things, especially in the early days of Gainsight, what were you doing when multiple people having to play wear multiple hats?
Oh yeah, totally. I remember in the early days of Gainsight, I was setting up the Wi-Fi in the office and doing the demos and everything, right? We all had that. I think you can still get organized about goal setting, even if you're smaller. It doesn't have to be some formal system, literally just writing them down, putting them in a sheet. And that's very important as a leader. And I think that being consistent is something that people put off too long. So consistency about what you do every week, your one-on-ones. I don't think there's an excuse that, we're too small for that. I think those kinds of things actually, it's a little bit like, hey, you can say when you're, you can always say, I'm going to work out later. I'm going to start eating healthy later. The truth is later comes pretty quickly. You got it. The best time to do it is now.
That's so true. Obviously, I want to get to know a little bit more about you. So you've accomplished a lot, right? We talked about you creating a category. You took a company from 0 to 100 million in ARR. You actually published 3 books. You were named the number 2 CEO by Software Reports, 99% approval rating on Glassdoor, spoke at so many conferences, married and have 3 kids. Now you're on the Coffee with Closers episode. You've accomplished a lot, right? So of all the things you've accomplished, what's the one thing that you're super proud of?
Well, that's a good one. Obviously being on this Coffee with Closers for sure.
Other than that, I'm sure you have some
I,
other things you
I,
can.
like obviously like family stuff, but I won't, since that's so common to everyone, I won't go to that one. I think the one that like work wise is I'm very proud of that we actually genuinely care about our culture and values. I know a lot of companies don't, or they do it and they say do it because they think they're supposed to do it and they don't really care and people get cynical. I think that human first and our values are real. I'm proud of that.
Mhm. What's your personal why? What motivates you and gives you the drive?
Yeah. So I was talking about my parents before, amazing parents. And there's definitely a few different backstories that kind of motivate me. One is kind of like that, my parents are immigrants from India and stereotypical kind of immigrant ambition of like wanting their kid to be hyper successful. So I remember when I was 8 years old and my dad was in the living room of our house in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he showed me like Time magazine and it had Bill Gates, youngest billionaire in the world, the youngest self-made billionaire. And my dad was like, I'd love for you to do something like this someday. I'm like, I'm still working on that. But like that drive and ambition to like, honestly, like make your parents proud and stuff like that. That's definitely one big thing that drives me. So that's one narrative. A second narrative is despite the fact that I'm much more extrovert now, I was very shy and lonely as a kid. I just didn't fit in, didn't have hardly any friends at all, ate alone at lunch every day in school. And so this idea of like connecting with people and like feeling like, feeling like I fit in and that they also fit in too and belonging, that's a second motivator for me. Mm-hmm. And then the third one is kind of maybe connecting these two together. I have found then that like, okay, this idea of human first business, it really does resonate. And it's not like we're the only ones that think about this. And there's many people who have different terms for the same thing, but it motivates me that there's something here that, people want a little bit more of a human approach to how you can win in companies. So those three things together.
What do you do, especially for personal development and as a CEO, continue to excel and grow in your ability to perform at a highest level?
A couple of things that are really big. I'm extremely, extremely rigorous in an annoying way on health routines. So I sleep 8 hours a night every night, unless I'm traveling or I can't fall asleep. I, do my Peloton bike every day. I do lots of other workouts throughout the week. I drink a couple gallons of water a day. Like I have this giant jug of water. I take my vitamins. I'm vegan. I walk at least 10,000 steps every day. So I have all these things I do to keep myself healthy, but also just to keep my energy up. I found that that's like so important, right? So that's kind of one theme is that. And then the second one is I love learning. So I read a ton. Mm-hmm. I read, I'm one of those people who reads audiobooks on 2X. Mm-hmm. So I listen to the audiobook and I can get through it. You do the same thing. Mm-hmm. So I listen to a lot of like 50, 60 books a year. Mm-hmm. And so combination of reading paper and listening. Mm-hmm. And so that lets me learn. And then, health lets me keep my energy up. Those are probably the two things. I also love meeting people and learning from them, even this conversation or many others. And so I love meeting other CEOs and leaders. It doesn't have to be CEOs, anyone. And I think I take a lot from that too. So those are probably my three ways to develop.
Do you have some sort of a decision-making framework that you follow, especially when you have to take some critical decisions?
I wouldn't say I have a decision-making framework, but I think at Gainsight, at least, our values are probably the closest thing to that. So one of the things we always do is look at one of our values called success for all, which is basically we want to drive success for our teammates, for their friends and family, for our customers, for our partners, and our investors. And we look at, for a given decision, how does this decision align with the needs of each of those stakeholders?
Mm-hmm. And obviously, you've said you're sending birthday notice to birthday emails to your new employees, and you do the employee onboarding, culture code conversations. You're also doing all these podcasts. You have to get a lot of things done. So, what do you do in terms of getting things done? Is there like some sort of
I'm very passionate about productivity. Part of it is I have an incredible team. So I have like the best assistant in the world, the best chief of staff, I have an awesome executive team. So I think if you're like, how would you do all this? I wasn't able to do all this earlier in my career, but now I have a great team, and Gainsight's, not a small company anymore. But then I'm very focused on systems. So I'm the annoying inbox zero person. I'm always at inbox zero almost throughout the day. Mm-hmm. And then I move everything that's a to-do to my task list. So rather than using my emails as a task list, I have a separate task list just using Google Tasks, and I'm constantly managing that. And then on that list, I have a list, different sub lists. One is, what am I going to get done today? what am I get done tomorrow, and then backlog, and then what am I waiting on other people for? And then I have a whole routine of how I process those lists once a week to review what should move between different segments, et cetera. One of the other things I do, which I think works really well, is I mentioned I email the company once a week, and I always say, like, what's happening in Gainsight? Basically, what did I do last week? And then what are my plans for this week? And then some personal stuff, what books I'm reading, what's happening in my family. So that's kind of my standard routine. By doing that, I reflect every week. I reflect, what did I get done last week? What am I going to do this week? Is that even the right things I should do? And so it forces me to actually do this. So if there's some way for you to publicly reflect or even privately reflect on where you spent your time and where you plan to spend your time, I think that's very helpful too.
Yeah, I've heard multiple guests I had that they have a Sunday routine where they do sit down and just do that reflection, which I'm hearing to be a common trend in high performers. So obviously you talked about like the kind of your productivity, and you mentioned earlier how you're following the scaling up model. So do you have like some sort of do you block out time? Is that one of your strategies? Well, especially for the corporate objectives, you might have some
it's a good question.
Execution items.
Yeah, it's funny. It's interesting. It's a good question. A lot of CEOs do block out time. I think one thing that I've figured out is I like to work in groups versus solo. Now, there's some things I have to work solo, because sometimes you need to take a stab at something or write like a strategy document, but I tend to like work better in groups. So what I'll do is schedule time with people to work on something or brainstorm on something. I found that that's a very effective way for me. I think other people like to work solo to start. And I think that's just more personality, getting to know yourself and how you like to work.
Mm-hmm. And knowing what you know today, what advice would you give your younger self?
I would say I wouldn't change anything, to be totally honest. So I would just say, enjoy it. It goes fast, and that's it, because I'm not a big believer in, I kind of think there's just one path and that's it. So I'm very happy with what I have. And I'm sure that there's individual things I could have wanted to change, but those would change everything. You're the butterfly effect, right? So for me, I don't ever want to change anything because I'm happy with where I am.
Awesome. Well, Nick, I certainly appreciate your time, and thanks for sharing your wisdom with our audience.
Thank you, Samuel. Great conversation.
This episode of Coffee with Closers is brought to you by One IMS, a leading digital marketing agency helping businesses win new customers. To request a free marketing ROI audit, please visit oneims.com. If you enjoyed this video, please share it. To make sure you never miss an episode, please subscribe.